Hello and welcome. As we continue now, we are continuing on a very good and important topic. And this one is the formation of the United Nations organization. So this is another wonderful topic. So let's be together. Let's move on together up to the end of the topic and see what are some of the facts behind this formation of the United Nations organization. Now, let's start with the origins and aims of the the United Nations organization. So the formation of the United Nations, this United Nations went through a series of stages between 1941 and 1945. So there were a number of things, a lot of things that took place between 1941 and 1945 towards the formation of the United Nations. So what are these things? What are these stages? So stay tuned. Let's be focused. Let's just move on together and see what happened exactly between 1941 and 1945 that led to the establishment or the formation of the United Nations organization. So let's start with 1941. So in 1941, there was the Atlantic meeting, Now, what happened on this one? You know, the Atlantic is the ocean. So what happened was that President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, you know, he was from USA, and the Prime Minister of Britain by the name Winston Churchill, these big men of Britain, Winston Churchill of Britain, they met in the American battleship by the name Augusta. This one, it was in the battleship that is in the ocean. That's why it is called the Atlantic meeting or the Atlantic meeting. They met in the Atlantic Ocean, in the warship, in the battleship. So there was, they were in the Atlantic Ocean off the Newfoundland, where they issued what was called the Atlantic Charter. So that was the beginning of it all. So two men were conversating in the battleship. What about this? What about this? Then at the end of the day, they drew a charter which was called the Atlantic Charter. Now, the charter or the agreement itself stated that the basic human freedoms were to be respected. So they agreed, the agreement between Britain and USA, they agreed to say, yes, we need to respect the basic human freedoms. We need to respect them. And they also emphasized on self-determination, on rights. Self-determination. What comes to your mind on that? Self-determination. Remember something on that. I hope now you remember. Remember the self-determination policy by Woodrow Wilson? So it was just a continuation of those things, a continuation of that idea of self-determination. So in here, we are saying that when the two gentlemen, Roosevelt and Churchill, met, they emphasized on self-determination, the rights of the people to be respected, disregarding where they are. So the people themselves, they need to be respected. So it called for an end to use of force in future and realization of a just peace, So they proposed all those things. Now, another one was the Washington Declaration. So it started 1941 in the battleship in the Atlantic Ocean, the two gentlemen. Now it went on. 1942, there is another meeting here, 1942, which was called the Washington Declaration. So what happened was that there were representatives. They came from 26 nations. And these ones, they met in Washington. You know, Washington is in USA. So they met in 1942. In 1942. So they promised to fight together against the Axis powers. Remember, we are talking of this period. It's when the Second World War is under course. It is on the way. People are fighting. Countries are fighting. The Second World War is still in course. So it was during that time when these meetings again were taking place. So 26 nations, they met in Washington and they promised each other to say, we are going to fight together against the Axis powers. Remember the Axis powers? We talk of Japan, we talk of Germany, we talk of Italy. So with that, they agreed on that. Now, the USA President Franklin Delano Roosevelt named this one, this meeting of 26 nations, he named it the United Nations. So you can have an idea now where this name now United Nations Organization, this one, where it came from. So it was Franklin Roosevelt who suggested this name United Nations because they united against what? The Axis powers. So the declaration was signed in 1942. They declared that we are going to fight, all of us 26 nations, we are going to fight against the Axis powers. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt called it the United Nations. Then it goes on. Here, the United Nations organization has not yet been established because here it's just a declaration whereby 26 nations now, they have come together and say, pledge their allegiance to the union to say we are going to fight against the Axis powers. And it was not an organization yet. But here, look at this now. The Moscow Conference. So this one, a Moscow Conference, it took place in 1943. So there were events one after the other from 1941, 1942. Now we are in 1943. That's up to 1945 when it was established. So what happened in 1943 was that in October 1943, representatives of USA, Britain, Russia, and China, they met in Moscow. So why did they meet there? There, after the meeting, after their deliberations, they agreed to set up an international organization. So there, you have to understand it very well there, that in 1942, it was not an organization. It was a declaration of 26 nations. But in 1943, these 4 nations, they are meeting there in Russia so that they agreed to set up an international organization. So why? Why that organization? The major aim was to maintain international peace and security. So that was the aim of agreeing to form that international organization. Then the journey goes on. That's why we're saying that, or we started by saying that this United Nations organization, it went through different stages for it to be formulated. Now we started 1941, 1942, 1943. Now we are on 1944. Another stage was in 1944. So in 1944, there was what was called the Dumbarton Oaks Conference. Dumbarton Oaks Conference in 1944. So representatives of USA, Britain, Russia, and China, they worked out the main structure of the organization. After they agreed in Russia to say we need, yes, to establish the organization, Then the following year, they met again in USA, where they drew up the structure. What could be the organs or the structure of this international organization? So those nations again, they met. So they also agreed on the name of the organization. Remember, when they met during that declaration, Washington Declaration, Franklin, he just suggested that that union of those 26 nations should be called the United Nations. It was not an organization. But now, later on, when they proposed a formation of the organization in Russia, later on now during this Dumbarton Oaks conference, that's when they wanted to agree on the name, to say what should be the name of this organization. Then in 1945, there was still another conference that was called the Yalta Conference. So this one took place in February 1945, whereby Roosevelt, USA, Churchill, Britain, and Stalin of Russia, they met at Yalta in Russia again. So the meeting dwelt much on the arrangements to turn the Japanese territory to Russia and reshape Poland. See? So they were strategizing to say, all right, the territories of Japan must go to Russia. So that was the major aim of this Yalta conference. Because remember, Japan was to the side of the Axis powers, was one of the Axis powers, Germany, Japan, Italy. So Russia and Britain, France, they were on the Allied forces. So when they met at Yalta, they also strategized on gaining the territories of Japan and giving them to Russia, and again reshaping Poland. Remember, during the outbreak of the war, what happened with Poland? Germany invaded Poland. So therefore, this time around, they were now reshaping it, regaining Poland from Germany. So they also promised to support popularly elected governments in countries liberated from Germany, to say all countries that were under Germany earlier on, this time around, if they are elected, if they choose their leaders properly, they are going to support those governments. So at the Yalta conference again, what they did was that they also agreed a number of things about the organization, that is the United Nations. So what did they agree at the Yalta conference? Number one was the voting procedure of this new organization, the United Nations. And not only that, they also agreed that USA, Russia, Britain, France, and China should be the permanent members of the Council, the Security Council. I think let's dwell much on this point. Remember, this is a big issue of the Security Council, to belong to the Security Council. Remember, at one time, Robert Mugabe was really against this structure of the United Nations, to say, no, we need at least an African representative as a member or a permanent member of the Security Council. So that one, even up to now, remember, even our president, when he went in 2019 to the United Nations, during his speech, he also mentioned or emulated that same speech by Mugabe, to say, yes, we need, or the United Nations need to reconsider Africa a place as a permanent member of the Security Council. At least one country in Africa need to represent Africa as a permanent member in the Security Council. So it is still just as it is there these five countries, they still remain the only permanent members, no representative state in Africa. So it is a debate still going on. So another thing that they agreed during this conference, remember we're talking of the Yalta Conference, 1945. They agreed of the next meeting to be held at San Francisco in USA. So the aim of that next meeting was to prepare the rules. You remember, an institution, a kingdom or a country cannot go without the rules, without the constitution. So any organization, any established organization, it needs to have the rules. That's why sometimes even a family, because it's a small organization there, it also needs to have some rules, the do's and the don'ts. Therefore, things will go on well. So they agreed that next meeting will be in USA at San Francisco, where they would design the rules of the United Nations. Now, here we are. The San Francisco meeting, we are now at San Francisco meeting or conference. So this one took place in 1945. So the meeting was held 2 weeks after the death of Roosevelt. So you see, the pioneers are not there to be there for forever. Sometimes if you start a thing, you pass it on to others through maybe retirement, by death, or maybe by voluntary retirement. So here we see Franklin Delano Roosevelt died in April 1945. So in June, the 50 nations, they signed the charter, the agreement of the United Nations. So the charter stipulated the basic principle of the United Nations. So 50 nations, you have to be very, very attentive here, very attentive, because we are now establishing the United Nations. So 50 nations, they were the first to sign that agreement of the United Nations. And the charter itself, the agreement, stipulated the basic principle. What is the basic foundation of the United Nations? So let's go through it. So the basic principle is to serve, the basic principle, to serve and succeeding generations, to serve succeeding generations from scourge of war. When we say a scourge of war, it's like epidemic of war, whereby the war starts and the war that destroys the property and lives, many lives. See, so like the First World War, the Second World War, these things or these wars, they were the scourge. It's like a scourge is like a fire that consumes or destroys many things, property and lives. So they wanted to save succeeding generations. Remember, they are signing in 1945. They are saying no. In the years to come, they were thinking of us who are living in the 2020s, 20 whatever. Yeah, they were thinking about the succeeding generations. Succeeding generations meaning the generations to come. So the major principle of the United Nations is to save the generations to come from the destructions of war. Not only that, to reaffirm faith, fundamental human rights, to reaffirm fundamental human rights, to say basic human rights, they have to be respected. The right to life, every human being has the right to life. Those are the basics. So if the United Nations was just to overlook that one, then nations would maybe doing things that would also destroy the lives of people. So respect of human rights, and also to establish conditions under which justice and respect would prevail. So those are the principle, or the basic principle, the basic principles of the United Nations under the agreement or the charter. So each and every country that signed, it signed that they were going to respect these principles. So the United Nations then was officially established on 24th October 1945. 24th October 1945. So it has its headquarters in New York at Manhattan. Manhattan, it's like a small island in New York City. So that's where there is the United Nations headquarters. Each and every year, leaders of all the member states, they go there for the General Assembly. They deliver their speeches there. So usually it takes place in September. That's when we hear that the president is going to the United Nations. When they go there, they are given time to present how they are faring, their countries are faring. So that's what that is happening there. Now, we have arrived at a very, very important part or aspect of this this topic. That is the aims. We have to look at the aims. We have now established, we have seen the establishment of the United Nations. So what were the aims of this organization? So number one was to preserve international peace and security, to ensure that there is peace internationally, to ensure that all the member states, there is peace and there is security. Not only that, the UN was also aimed at to develop friendly relations among the nations. Friendly relations, the member states, they need to be friendly. Malawi and Tanzania, we need to live friendly. We need each other. See, we need each other. Malawi, Mozambique, we need each other. Malawi, Zambia, Malawi and all other countries, we need a friendly relations, because a nation or a country cannot survive on its own. We still need other countries for our survival. They supply us with other things which we do not have here. For example, we have oil. We don't have oil here. We don't have oil. We import it from somewhere. Now, for us, for that oil to reach Malawi, it has to pass through other countries. What if those countries were not in good relations? They will deny the passage. And what will happen to Malawi? Things will not go on well. So no country can live independently on its own. No, it cannot happen, and it will never happen. We rely on others. Maybe sometimes a country like Malawi, we produce our tobacco. We don't smoke all the tobacco ourselves. We rely on other countries to buy our tobacco. What if those who buy our tobacco, we are not in good terms? Then what will happen to our tobacco? We cannot even manage to smoke it all. Therefore, it will just rot there. What will happen? Then our economy will be destroyed there. So they were there to develop friendly relations among the nations. So to ensure that there is that one. And again, the United Nations is also aimed at to safeguard individual human rights, to make sure that individual human rights are respected. That's why you see when people die because of the recklessness of the government, the president becomes answerable to the International Court of Justice because of that crime against humanity. To say, why could you leave the people or leave the people fight against each other? Let's take just a small thing or a small example to say maybe if one village against another village. You see that one village rise against another village and it kills maybe 100 people, and the government does nothing on that. Then the president becomes answerable to say, you have committed a crime against humanity. How could you allow such thing to happen when you are there, when you are the head of the government? So to safeguard the human rights of individuals. And also, the United Nations is aimed at achieving or to achieve international cooperation in solving social and cultural problems. So the United Nations is also there to assist in the international cooperation in as far as socio-economic and cultural problems are concerned. So the United Nations is there for all those aims. Now, we have to see the organization and the function of the United Nations. Yeah, the organization and function of the United Nations. Organization and function. Now, as an organization, the United Nations, it had organs or parts or sections or the structures. So what were these? Number one was the General Assembly. So the General Assembly, this one, it is the central organ, the central part of the United Nations organization. And all member states are represented in this assembly. Each and every country that is a member is also represented in the assembly. That's why we have said that every year all member states, they gather there in New York for the General Assembly. So each member country, each member state has one vote. When it comes to voting, each member state has one vote. So matters are mostly decided by a simple majority. There are 30 people voting and 22 they say yes. 8 they say no. Then the vote is carried. On 30 again, maybe 16 say no, 14 say yes. The no carries the day because they are more than the yes. So that is what we mean by the simple majority. Now, functions of the assembly. The assembly is there to carry out the decisions of the United Nations. So you can see here, decisions of the United Nations are made as a group, are made as an assembly. When they come, they gather together. That's when they say, what do we do as the United Nations? There is nothing like an independent person in the United Nations who makes the decision. No, decisions, they are made as a group. And also the General Assembly or the Assembly, it admits or expel admission and expulsion of members. So the Assembly has got that mandate to admit new members, to say if a country wants to join, then that one, it is approved by the Assembly. If a certain country has proved to misbehave, the Assembly has got also the mandate to expel a member or a country, to say you are no longer a member of the United Nations. And they also appoint the judges of the International Court of Justice. So those judges, they are appointed by the Assembly. They also appoint General Secretary to the Secretariat. We hear the Secretariat of the United Nations is headed by the General Secretary. So the General Secretary is appointed by the General Assembly. And its official language, the languages that the United Nations or the Assembly, when they go there, when they meet, the languages that they use are English, French, Chinese, Russian, Spanish, and Arabic. Those are the languages. That's why if you have ever seen this assembly on TV, you find that they put some headsets. Some put some headsets because maybe if they speak English, the one who is presenting is speaking English. There are others who do not speak would not hear English. Then they choose the language because they are interpreters. So they understand their languages through the headsets there. Because when one is speaking, that language is interpreted to all these languages at the same time. Then we have looked at organ number 1. Then let's look at the organ number 2 is the Security Council. The Security Council, it deals with the matters of peace and security. So what it does is that it can enforce its decisions through diplomatic, economic, and military sanctions. These are not strange, or maybe they are. No, I don't think so, because we talked about them during the League of Nations. They were also there. The League of Nations was also using the same in matters of security or imposing discipline on a member. So they were using diplomatic sanctions, economic sanctions, as well as military sanctions. So it means the United Nations adopted from the League of Nations against any country that threatens peace. So they were using those. So it also involved appointment of judges to the International Court of Justice. So they were appointing and being approved by the assembly, the judges. It has 5 permanent members. We have talked about it: USA, France, Britain, China, and Russia. So these are the permanent members of the Security Council. So it also elects 10 non-permanent members for a period of 2 years. So 10 non